Hey, Sub here. Wanted to take a minute to kind of go over some of the patch notes that dropped today with some of the big changes that came into the game, specifically looking at Warzone, but this affects Black Ops 6 as well, the multiplayer side of it, and probably zombies. Um, One of the really interesting thing that's happened over the last few years to Warzone, ever since Warzone 2 came into play, we got a really strong introduction to kind of their realism engine, and one of the side effects of that was trying to create an artificial skill gap, not through kind of necessarily the skillful means, but by making it more difficult to engage in gunfights. With the, I think, underlying principle being that if guns are more difficult to manage, then the top tier players won't be able to be as effective with them, and so it'll generally lower the skill gap overall, resulting in kind of like an easier time for the majority of the player base because the highest level players, the highest skilled players aren't going to be able to necessarily beam everybody across the map as well as they could in Warzone 1, right? If we remember Warzone 1, the guns were very easy to use with minimal recoil at best. And so one of the big complaints was that there was it kind of had a very narrower skill gap in that because the guns are so easy to use, they don't require a lot of skill, and therefore it's easier for anybody to kind of hit their shots. And so Warzone 2 introduced a really impactful suite of characteristics to their guns and to the gunplay that we saw in the game, with the idea of visual recoil and gun movement, right? That wasn't related to accuracy. So in Warzone 1, if you had a powerful gun, for example, typically what you would see is you would see a recoil pattern, strong recoil pattern, with a decent amount of deviation off center. So it would be more difficult to learn how to use, right? The Cold War AK is an excellent example. You saw a alternating kind of zigzag pattern, right, which created a lot of minute lateral movement in the gun when you fired it, kind of a side to side movement to it. But you could learn to adapt to it, and you can actually be very effective with it. And for those who learned it, it was a very powerful firearm to use in the game. And for a lot of players, it wasn't something they could ever master, right? So there was a skill gap in learning that firearm, learning that gun, and how to use it properly. In Warzone 2, they kind of moved away from that, and instead approached it in the matter of making all of the guns more challenging to use, and kind of identified it under the idea of realism, right? So it looked or felt more realistic to how a firearm would fire or would handle, in theory. I don't know that it's necessarily true when you look at it side by side, but that was their idea, right? So the guns would have some movements not related to accuracy. What I mean by that is, you would have kind of a bob and sway both when it's idle, and when you're shooting it, right? The reticle moves. You saw some parallax when you would move the target left to right, right? You would see the front sight become misaligned with the rear sight, which may or may not be a thing that you see in real life. But it adds a difficulty to fight to using the guns. And then there's a visual shake that occurs, right? Physically, the gun model moves on the screen, specifically the rear sight moves independently of the front sight, creating a kind of literally a gun shake. The whole model shakes and it feels like it's rattling in your hands. In the quest of creating a more realistic feel to the engagement. Um, and I think one of the underlying principles behind this is that they wanted to have a slightly reduced or modified skill gap, right? Where the best players are now hampered, right? And not able to exceed or to excel in having high accuracy gunfights over range, which, is a nice theory. Unfortunately, the reality is all of these things, I think, did not have as much of a mechanical impact on the highest tier players in the game. If we all remember, the AIM-OP V4 was the go-to optic for everybody, on just about every gun because it had the lowest recoil, visual recoil in the game. And the best players could still beam you across the map. and they were very, very good at it. Especially once they got rid of alternating recoil patterns, some of these other elements that we haven't seen since partway through Modern Warfare 2. And so one of the really big benefits, or one of the really big challenges that occurred, is that um, instead of creating a situation in which the top level players are negatively impacted, right, while the rest of the player base kind of is able to move a little bit closer, you have reducing the skill gap in that way. What ended up happening is the best players would master these guns and this visual recoil system while not enjoying it, and often, very often, voicing their complaints about how unenjoyable it was to use. They could still use them very effectively and hit shots and beam people at very good ranges, as much as the guns actually allowed you to, right? With From the damage profiles, but the ability to aim the guns and hit their shots was not drastically impacted. And that is because most of these top tier players actually played on controller. And so they were able to actually use aim assist um, to stay on target, even though they physically could not see the target. This was a common complaint from mouse and keyboard players, was that, aim assist would keep you on target as long as you could keep the reticle close enough. Aim assist could do some last mile corrections for you and actually allow you to beam players at a greater distance than you would otherwise, especially if you couldn't necessarily see them in the reticle. Okay, because the computer knows you could see them, even though you physically could not because of visual recoil. The lower skill players, on the other hand, were drastically negatively impacted by that, and a lot of players had some significant drops in their accuracy over time, over the course of Modern Warfare 2, specifically because of this feature, because it was much more difficult to hit shots. Visual recoil made it more difficult to stay on target, especially if as lower skilled players have a more difficult time traditionally um, in being able to rely on aim assist to do the last mile corrections instead of visually being able to observe it. And so this whole thing sets up today's patch notes, which I was very surprised to see. I did not expect it. And I think from the point of view of Raven and Treyarch and their efforts to fix the things that Infinity Ward brought to us in Modern Warfare 2 versus Modern Warfare 1, it was a huge W. And as someone who has been especially critical of this Warzone integration, which is surprising because the Warzone, the Black Ops 6 multiplayer is, in my opinion, such a phenomenal experience that having a Warzone integration go this less than ideal was surprising to me. Um, Today's fixes are kind of unbelievable. And I think that the majority of people on the timeline today have been in agreement that this is a huge W. And I'll tell you who this is going to be really impactful for is actually going to be the average players and the below average players who now they have one less thing to fight against, right? So what they did is they basically all but eliminated the visual gun shake, the kind of underlying difficulties and challenges that Modern Warfare 2 brought to us and introduced. Things like uh, significant idle sway, significant aim fire sway, heavy gun kick when you have magnified optics, the actual shake of the gun, as much as 75% reduction in some, in some firearms. And then they really improved the idle sway experience. And so when you look at it in terms of what that looks like, when you watch this side by side, this is the XM4 demonstrated by Raven Software, it's unreal how much better this looks and how much easier this is going to be to actually see what you're shooting at. And so as a player, as players who are average skilled, who often will be able to use aim assist to some degree, but it doesn't there isn't that instinctiveness to let aim assist take the wheel, right? That a lot of players suffer from and deal with and have for the last few years, where it is difficult to let go of that control. And as a result, there's a lot of missed shots because people just can't see what they're shooting at because the gun model moves so much and there's so much going on underneath it that it pulls away your human ability to accurately correct and track targets. And you have to use the computer to do it for you because of the way the game is designed. And we are getting away from that back to where Warzone 1 was significantly improved in this way compared to Warzone 2, where you didn't have to rely on the computer because you could see the target and you could keep the target in your reticle, and your reticle lined up with where you were shooting. And you can see it in this example. You can see the front post pulled to the left of this of the ring in the way that it used to, in the before versus the after, where it stays centered where it should be. These changes are going to be huge for the majority of the player base. This is going to be one of those things that players who have struggled in Warzone accurately hitting their shots, especially at ranged, and have relied on maybe snipers or just avoided the long range engagements in general because of issues like this, because maybe they cannot explain why, but they understand that it is more difficult than it should be. We'll have those doors open to them. So overall, this is such a huge change. I am shocked they did it. And I'm really excited to see how the game feels going forward, especially if changes like this continue. And as we lead into Verdansk early next year, we're able to actually have the feel in Warzone that we lost after Warzone 2, and that going forward, we're going to potentially actually get back to it. And I think this opens the door for that opportunity, which is very exciting. And I think that Warzone players in specific, Call of Duty players in general, but Warzone players in specific, should be overly optimistic that changes like this will continue. Because if they are, when Verdansk drops, we might actually be back.